going to have not a diversion. It's not a diversion away from Ecclesiastes. It's still in Ecclesiastes, but I don't want to just blow by this word that we kind of just started to look at last week, okay? And I'll tell you that word here in a minute. And although I will say that I think everything that we talk about is and can be practical, applicable to everyday life, although sometimes you have to really kind of talk about it to figure out how are big concepts, how are big ideas practical to everyday life. But today I hope that we can get to something that I think is entirely practical, and then we as a group talk about what helpful activity can be had towards this practical kind of application. So we're going to talk about, first of all, I've got laid out right here, again, this idea in Ecclesiastes that we've already talked about is what man does or makes. So there's that Hebrew kind of verb that's being used and talking about what man does, and it also means makes, and what God does and makes, okay? And if you remember, just for review, what have we talked about regarding, there's one of our lost masks, Ronnie. What was Solomon setting out to do? What did he say in the first couple of chapters? Remember? What's Solomon trying to figure out? I mean, he's trying to figure out a lot of things. We've already talked about, he's trying to connect the dots. He's trying to understand what's going on in this world. But specifically, what is he trying to figure out? You remember? Okay, yes. So she just said what's good, but specifically what's good? What's good for man to do? Remember, he's trying to figure out from his perspective, and when I say his perspective, I'm saying from a creature's perspective. So we've already laid this out. God's already told Solomon and us what is good for man to do. We already laid that out in Genesis. Solomon would have been well aware of that. And Solomon in his creatureness is still trying to figure that out, though, right? You guys we've already talked about that extensively. From his kind of creature heart perspective, he's looking at what God has said, but then he's looking at man, he's looking at life, he's looking at work and toil, and he's trying to figure out what really is good. What is the purpose of man to do? Okay, and again, we've already laid that out regarding from the human perspective, from the creature perspective. And how is that related to, or do you guys remember what is that told us about maybe what Solomon's wrestling with regarding God? You guys kind of, again, this is just for rehash sake. What's that? So with Solomon trying to set out, well, okay, now, even though Solomon didn't say this, God's already told us what's good for man to do, but yet Solomon's trying to figure out what is good for man to do, or what is the purpose of this whole thing called life. What does that tell you about maybe what's going on in Solomon's heart or mind regarding God himself? So Greg just said, did a good King James, by the way. He said, "Hath God said." So why did Greg just say that? What's that remind you of?
Yes.
You said deception, hiss. It reminds you of Genesis again, right? That's exactly what Satan said from the very beginning, right? Did God really say that? Is that what God really, really? It's the heart of man, okay? Really? Is this really what God has for us? Is that really what's good? So, again, that's just the background here. Again, that's just normal human perspective. You and I, armchair quarterback, we troubleshoot decisions in every aspect of our lives, okay? From politicians to your boss, to your spouse, to your neighbor, to just somebody walking down the street you don't even know. That's just what we do. So let's look at this. What does man do or say? You have something, Ronnie?
Well, I just wanted to read verse 13. One
113.
Because it is the verse that's declaring what Solomon is saying. And it says, I have given my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. That, and it's literally the word evil, task, God has given to the sons of man that they may be exercised by which. So we talked about that perspective of even God. He's even saying it's this, I mean, he uses the word, Hebrew word for evil. So it's even a negative, his perspective of what God has them occupied with is negative.
You guys hear that? So look at verse 13 in chapter 1, okay? And it's interesting that, and we'll see what your translation says, and my version says, and I applied in my heart to seek and search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. And he says it is, and then what Ronnie is saying is the actual Hebrew word there is evil. My version says unhappy. It's just interesting what, interpreters, what they decide, what words they decide to use. So mine says, it is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. The actual Hebrew word is evil, that it's an evil business. So again, this is from Solomon's perspective, kind of right off the bat. And what is he, just me saying unhappy, Ronnie just told us that the Hebrew word is actually the word for evil. Any other words that you guys have in your translation?
Burdensome.
Burdensome.
Grievous.
Sore. Sore. Again, what's really interesting too with the interpreters is if you look what year that interpretation was written, or what era, from the King James and on, that you even see a contextual kind of a generational / whatever. So sore, grievous, unhappy, burdensome, adverse. So again, it tells you what his perspective, at least right there, from a human perspective, what his perspective of God is. And he's saying that this is the grievous, burdensome task that God has given man. Okay? So again, that's just from Solomon's perspective. And so he's trying to figure out, hey, what is the purpose of man then? I'm looking at this grievous task that God has given us. And what would you and again, this isn't a quiz question, that grievous task, just with what we've gone through in Ecclesiastes so far, just generally speaking, what's the grievous task, or what's he referring to? Have any idea, or what are your thoughts regarding that? What is that burdensome task? What's this labor that he's kind of referring to as grievous or negative, sore?
Meaning? What the meaning is? Meaning of life?
Okay, it could be like just the meaning of life itself. Because what do we know right up front that Solomon says about that?
It's vanity.
It's vain. It's vanity. We're going to get to that word here in just a second. So, and I'll say right up front, what does man make? What does he do? And Solomon really encapsulates that by that, the result of what man does, again, man's intent, and what he's trying to get, it's vanity. It is vain. And we've already talked about that, so I like the word empty in talking about the word vain. To me, that just brings up all kinds of other passages in Scripture that is comparing or contrasting empty versus full. We see Paul talking about using that word full over and over again, or abundant. So this idea of full or abundance as far as what is found in God versus, or what is the result of what God's activity is versus the result of man's activity. Empty versus full. Vain. You got any other helpful words for you when we say vain that you want me to put up here?
Well, the definition for vanity is empty and valueless. It's also another Webster.
Valueless. And I've used the word worthless. Okay, it doesn't have any value.
Well, and that's futile is what my translation used for vanity, and its definition was serving no useful purpose and completely ineffective. So those are different.
no useful purpose. Okay, so vain, futile. So I want to show you some other, well, and by the way, and again, thanks to Ronnie and looking some of this stuff up. This word, this Hebrew word, is used 73 times in the Old Testament. Out of that 73 times, 38 times it's used in Ecclesiastes. So the overwhelming majority of the use of this word is right here in this book. And then here's some other ones. It's really interesting when you start to look at this. So Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 21 says this. They have provoked me to jealousy. Now think about what's going on there. This is Moses is talking to the Israelites before they cross over the river into the promised land. Moses can't go. All of Deuteronomy is kind of a recount of what God has done for his people and cautionary words for his people regarding, hey, when you get into the promised land and you are overwhelmed with satisfaction and riches and everything else, like I've said before, Moses basically says, you're going to become fat, dumb, and happy, and beware, because you're going to think you did this for yourself, that you got this for yourself. So it's this book where Moses is reminding them to remember who God is, what he's done, and don't forget. But listen to this. It says, they have provoked me to jealousy by that which is not God. They have provoked me to anger with or by their, in most of your translations. Matter of fact, I think just in the quick look that I looked at all the different interpretations, the word that is used is idols. So it says, they have provoked me to anger with or by their idols. Do you know what actual word that is? With their vanity. With their vanities, their worthlessness. So again, it's which is really interesting. I mean, why? I don't. That just strikes me as amazing. So you see idols. Kind of, what is the connotation when you hear the word idols? What's the big picture that all you guys that have grown up in church or been in church for any period of time? What is it that you picture and think of?
I think it'd be if you go to a Buddhist temple and you see all the little statues of their ancestors and stuff. I think of that when I think of idols.
Yeah, so you think of these
things.
things.
It's modernly practiced over there.
Okay, so you think of these actual idols, right? These things that, a person is constructed and they bow down to this thing. So this kind of religious, pagan, again, that we know through all the Old Testament, God is talking about the idols or the things that the Israelites have created that, like he says right there, which is not God, and they've created something else that they're following. But I find it fascinating that the word here is actually this word for vanities, not the actual literal word for idol. Because before, I think of it more in that Old Testament kind of Christian, Old Testament religious sense that he's like chastising them for looking at this idol that they've built and they're bowing down to. Versus vanity. I mean, what's the impression you guys get? Anything? Instagram? You're not even on Instagram. What are you talking about? Yeah, I mean, what do you mean by that?
Something you value more instead of God.
Okay,
Instead
so,
of your time doing that, those things that take your mind and actions away from focusing on God.
and again, it's not just merely, hey, it's taking my focus away from God. It's, what we've already seen in Ecclesiastes is I'm trying to get something from that. I'm trying to get purpose. I'm trying to get meaning. I'm trying to get satisfaction. I mean, that's the toil of man. That's the labor of man. It's not something you don't do anything that's just like mindless necessarily. If you're really to peel back the onion layers of your own heart, everything that we do, I'm trying to get something from it, okay? So you said, so Instagram, this distraction from God, but yet it's my attempt to get something outside of God, okay? This satisfaction, purpose, meaning. What were you going to say? Television. Okay, we're using examples in our culture right now. But again, I hope that you're able to see that in its deepest sense. Not just, okay, I'm like as if, and I'm not saying that this is what you're saying. It's just when I hear good examples like that from everyday life, again, in typical church land, you can get this idea that, like for instance, TV. TV is bad because it's distracting me from God, and I might see something that might, fill in the blanks and all that stuff. No, the deeper meaning that we're talking about here is I am doing something that I'm trying to get, again, purpose, meaning, satisfaction, peace, security. Ultimately, when you boil this down, I'm trying to get life for myself outside of what God has already, He's already said, He's given me life. But yet I'm going, oh, hey, I'm okay. I can do this on my own. I'm going to get it for myself. So really interesting. That Deuteronomy word is this idea that he uses the word for vanities. It can mean all kinds of things. Because it can be, I think of normal church where I've sat in church as a kid or a young 20s and people are talking about idols or people are talking about stuff. Look, my family didn't have a TV. My parents took, that stance when I was very young. We didn't have a TV. I couldn't listen to rock and roll music. I could only listen to Christian music and classical music. Don't ask me why classical music was included there, but I guess it was supposed to make me smarter. So I could listen to preachers preach about the normal stuff that were in people's lives, and I could go, well, that's not in my life, so this didn't really apply to me. I didn't have that immoral stuff or that whatever it is that you wanted to talk about. I wasn't exposed to that stuff, so I could go, that's not talking about me. Whereas when you think about it in terms of that, vanities. Hey, I had a lot of stuff in my life that I was chasing after, that I was trying to get life from, trying to get satisfaction, trying to get, what'd you say, Greg? Security. Significance.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a Deuteronomy passage. They provoke me to anger with or by their vanities. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 15 says, they rejected his statutes and his covenant that he had made with their fathers. And then later on in the verse it says, and they became idolaters. Again, guess what that word is? They acted vainly. They became vain, empty actors. Again, they were chasing after stuff that was empty. It was valueless. And of course, with the Old Testament, I'm not trying to discount the fact that did they chase after false gods and the pagan stuff and the idols were involved with that? Oh yeah, they did. We know that. That was a picture-perfect example of the immorality of their day. But if you think about it in terms of, hey, even those people that didn't chase after or didn't have that certain idol in their house or whatever, guess what they still were doing? They were idolaters in the sense that they were vain actors, chasing after emptiness. Psalm 94:11. Yahweh knows, you guys know this word. Yahweh knows the thoughts of man. You know what he says after? That they are vain. They are futile. Same thing. Yahweh knows the thoughts of man and that they are futile. It's vanity. It's chasing after valueless things. I hope you can make the connection to your life right now. I mean, to me, just vivid examples in my own life. And I don't mean examples like time I waste or time I'm distracted from God. I'm talking about thinking about the times over the course of this last week that I was frustrated, dissatisfied, impatient. Again, it's something that we've talked about here for a long time. Those are flags that start waving in my life that show me that I am seeking after, I'm trying to pursue security or life or peace on my own. And I'm wanting it out of something, and the impatience, the frustration, whatever your flavor is that you're experiencing, is an indicator that I'm not getting what I'm hoping to get out of this thing that I'm laboring in. I hope you guys can get that. Any clarification? You want to clarify anything, Jeff?
I am thinking, misunderstanding, it could seem like we're saying, hey, that's wrong. I mean, what you're saying is we do that. It's not like, hey, stop doing that. I mean, again, it's almost like we're always operating that way to some degree. So is this a admonition to stop doing that, and then what? You know,
Yeah, well, again, this is something that, for those of you that have heard me speak for a long time, you know that I'm not trying to put shoulds on you. I'm trying to encourage you to recognize and admit what is. And then the value of that is recognizing who God is and what He's doing in our lives. So, yeah, I'm not trying to put a should on you with that pun that I use often. That I won't use it. I'm not trying to put a should on you, more burden on you to go, okay, now if you're feeling like, if that's the way you're experiencing yourself during the week, like the example that I gave, frustration, impatience, dissatisfaction, the journey now or the work now is not, okay, how do you get rid of that out of your life? How do you figure that out and get rid of that because that's bad stuff for a Christian? No, my perspective now is that, like I said, it's a flag that's waving, that's giving us the opportunity to recognize who God is and who I am. That I need God's help now in the midst of this. And this is an opportunity for me to go take a deep breath in and breathe out and go, okay, wait a minute. I'm still trying to be king of my life. And God has released me from that. He's given me freedom from that, and now I can rest in Him. Yeah, Tracy.
Well, and to piggyback with what Jeff is saying, that Solomon is saying that this is a state of how it is on earth. So now in Christ.
Okay, hold on. You guys heard that? We've already said that extensively, right? Solomon is giving us a picture of the state of living on earth. You know, verses 2 through 7 gives all those different lists of the good and the bad of life. Okay, the hating and the loving, the living and the dying, so he's giving us a picture of, wow, this is what life is. Go ahead.
Well, then, but Christ covers that. So then, to make the point that Jeff and then you were saying is, I still struggle with the worthlessness of pursuing. I think Laura said for significance or whatever those things are. Christ covers that. It is forgiven, but we will not be free from that until we're in His presence, until we're out of this body and in His presence. So the relief, the rest is, there is no condemnation. But it does help to understand the angst that we all live in on a daily basis. That is, and being a Christian does not relieve us of that angst. That we know we're covered, we are loved, He even sympathizes with us in that angst that we live in. But we won't be free from it. That's where now people, when they say, what do you think heaven's like? Oh my gosh, like to be free from the vanities and the worthlessness that we're like in this rat race trying to pursue because our system says we gotta do that. So anyway.
Right, and the incredible, I can even say the feeling of thinking about heaven and being completely free of myself.
Yeah.
It's mind-blowing, and I know I'm only barely feeling that right now, okay? But I do want to clarify, too, that it is both and. Yes, you're right in the sense that, hey, we're not going to be free from life and myself. This, you know, we started talking about last week, again, the conflict. We read the R.C. Sproul quote that talked about, hey, life doesn't really become hard until you become a Christian. And what he was referring to was now all of a sudden you recognize there's a battle in yourself. And that angst that you're talking about. So we're not going to be free from that battle. I think Paul is clear on that. We're not going to be free from that conflict, from that battle until God finally takes us home. And God provides peace and comfort and freedom in the midst of that battle. So I would still say that there's both and. Which, again, we're going to get to some of that practical piece of what Solomon points to here in chapter 3. So I want to get there. So here we go. No more, I was just looking for other hands. So you guys know this verse too. Proverbs, which is more than likely Solomon, 16, verses 25 through 26. All you good Christian people know this one. There is a way that seems right to man, but its end is the way of death. Now, what's really interesting, so I'm going to put not caps, right way of man equals death. Now watch, we all know that one verse right there, but the next verse says the person who labors for himself. Isn't that really interesting in light of what Solomon has already said in Ecclesiastes? He uses that word labor, toil, work over and over again. And he's talking about the toiling or the laboring, the working of man. So he says right here, there's a way that seems right to man. And he's talking about that toiling. But its end is the way of death. Again, that vein, what we're pursuing in our toiling, apart from God. And he says, the person who labors for himself. For his, in the interpreter says, his hungry mouth urges or drives him on. Just, again, how does that strike you? His hungry mouth urges him on. Now that's the way the Hebrew language was kind of giving a picture of understanding hunger. But do you think he's just talking about like the hunger or desire in one's mouth? Like I work because I'm hungry?
We're insatiable. That's the bottom line.
You guys hear what Patrick just said? We're insatiable. The bottom line. And what's insatiable? I mean, when you say that word, what are you talking about there? Or what are you referring
We
to?
want what we want, and we never stop wanting.
Can't be
For
satisfied.
lots of different things.
So we want what we want, and I can never get satisfied. And again, this is the regular human heart, right? I'm trying to get something. I want satisfaction. I want peace. All the different things. Even looking at hunger, I want to be freed from my desire for hunger, and it's insatiable. I've said that over and over again. You know, I love sport. I love a lot of things. I love stocks. I love finances. I like trying to make some money.
You like food too, as I recall.
I like food. I used to be a lot skinnier. But whenever I get to a certain point that I think is going to make me happy or I find satisfaction or joy in, guess what happens? Maybe for 10 seconds, I feel this fleeting sense of satisfaction and achievement and accomplishment, and then guess what? It rolls right in. The desire for more. Just a little more. That's interesting. I hear that, it's not those words, but I just, in my mind, I'm thinking, hey, just one more bite.
Didn't you just eat yesterday?
I did eat yesterday. What's your point?
We ate yesterday. You should be done.
I should be done.
Appetite.
Insatiable desire. So again, what does man do? What does man make? What does he do? And what Solomon points out is that what he does, and again, what's behind that is I'm trying to get something for myself, by myself. And the end result of that is death. My right way of trying to acquire for myself life, security, fulfillment, satisfaction, purpose, it ends in death. And that, again, that's apart from God. So that's the vanity that Solomon is talking about. But then where does Solomon go? Even though it still seems somewhat negative, and we've already gone through this, but I'm going to read some other verses regarding what God does and makes. So chapter 3, verse 11 says, and again, like Tracy just said, we've already seen that this is just the way life is. So we see that Solomon is presenting life as it is for a human, for a creature. Yeah.
Even, we can swing to the one side of it, the insatiable idea of that verse, but there's the practical side of that verse too, that man has to eat. In this life, man has to eat or he will die. I mean, literally. So there is just that broad spectrum. So even the little ways that we're trying to provide and
you guys, I mean, and I think the reason you bring that up is because, again, not necessarily trying to say, okay, so all that stuff you guys are seeking out there is bad and terrible, and stop doing it. That's not what I'm saying. Because there, especially with what Solomon is portraying, is that, yeah, this is the reality of man as far as we're trying to get something from the toil. I say get something. And again, that's the deeper stuff, the satisfaction, the spiritual security, the spiritual significance and fulfillment and purpose and life and all of that stuff. But the reality is, I still have to eat while I'm here. I have to work in order to eat. I do things that provide security for my family. And that's a practical thing that I think God laid that out in the garden. He says, go and work. And this is where you're going to see Solomon go. Is that doesn't mean that we don't work anymore. We don't toil, we don't labor. That still happens, but you do it from a different perspective. And that's what we're going to get to here. We do it for a different purpose. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That hey, there's the practical reality of life here is I still have to do this stuff. I can't lay around and go, okay, God, miracle food into my mouth, give me some manna and some quail like you did the Israelites. So you still have to, so yeah, thank you for that perspective. So chapter 3, verse 11. So what does God do? What does He make? What is this perspective? This foundation right here of the reality here, if left to myself, and the reality of life with Don here on earth, what does it point us to? And what is Solomon pointing us to? And we've already gone through this last week, so I want to hurry up. Chapter 3, verse 11. He, God, has made everything beautiful in its time. And again, that's referring back to chapter 1, and verses 2 through 7, or 2 through 8, where he lists all of the things of regular life, some of which are sinful, bad, yucky stuff. If you don't remember, he says, vanity of vanities, what does man gain by all the toil with which he toils? It's chapter 3. Chapter 3, there's a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down, a time to build up, a time to weep, a time to laugh. So all of those things. A time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Well, then Solomon points to this and says, God has made everything beautiful in its own time. It was brought up last week, Romans 8:28, where Paul says, everything. He says, everything that happens to me is intended for my good and God's glory. So, verse 11 says, He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men. So that concept, we talked about it last week, that concept of what I think is the reality of we know that there's eternity. We're not just left to this hopeless kind of vain thinking that life is here and it's gone and that's it. So He set eternity in the heart of man, but I think He's pointing to something even bigger here, and it's what we talked about last week, this idea of purpose and motivation, purpose for living. So it says, He has also set eternity in the hearts of men, and they cannot fathom the work that God has done from beginning to end. So again, with this idea that everything that God is doing from the beginning to the end, and what we're going to see here in one of the last verses of chapter 3 is guess what? God just keeps doing the same thing over and over again. The same thing being what? That He just said in verse 11 right here. He's doing beautiful stuff. That everything that we're experiencing in this life, according to God, is beautiful. It's meant for His good purpose. And if you weren't here last week, you can check it out online where we filled that in a little bit. I think in more detail. So He has made everything beautiful. Everything meaning even death, and that yucky stuff that he talks about at the beginning of chapter 3. This life, and this is the beautiful thing about it, is that idea of God with us. That in the midst of life, I was going to put God overall as far as all of it, but I couldn't write that small. But so in the midst of the reality of life and what Solomon says here, what is God doing? He is, in a sense, making, he says, beautiful everything, I'll just say, you go through. He's making beautiful everything that you go through. He's setting eternity in the hearts of men, and they can't fathom it. The work that God has done from beginning to end. So this is, well, it's right here, so I'll just say work. So this is God's work. Psalm 127. Actually, I'm going to turn there real quick. You guys know this one, but it just, when you're seeing these words, especially when we're talking about working, labor, and this idea of vanity. Psalm 127, verse 1. It says this: a song of ascents of Solomon. Isn't that interesting? Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain, in futility. Again, with what we talked about, what is the reference there? What is Solomon referring to? Is it just the mere work is vain?
Just the living is vain.
Yeah, it's the underlying intent.
You're striving that if you don't have God as your center, you don't have a goal for eternity, you're literally striving for nothing. I've tried to do that. I tried, when I was in the guard or whatever, I tried to make that my priority. When I was playing baseball, I tried to make that my priority, try to make that the center of my life. And it doesn't fulfill me. The only thing that can fulfill me is eternity. Because, especially, you know this, when you're faced with your mortality, you realize there's more to life than just being on this earth, right? There's an eternity that you have to live for, and I think that really is what gives meaning. I think
Gives you what?
Gives you meaning. Is striving after eternity, is striving to be with God. Especially when you live through, this life is ugly.
Yeah, that's why our church specifically is built for broken people.
Thank you.
Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. Again, it's talking about this idea of the work of God versus the work of man. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 14. And I know that everything God makes endures forever. Let's see if there's any other interpretive. I perceive that whatever God does, and again, that's does or makes, endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor taken from it. And it says, God does it so that they will fear Him. Any thoughts on that verse? We talked about it last week, but go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, that last part, as you read it, it is kind of a fearful thing to look at all the ups and downs that are listed at the beginning of the chapter, and to wrestle with the fact that God says that is all part of His beautiful plan, because He's, like you said, half of that list is things we would say, oh man, I want to take things like that. I want to avoid that at all costs. So to be confronted with a thought that's so foreign to us, it does kind of force us to reckon with how small we are, and this idea of fear. God is big. It's not just be afraid, like spooked or terrified in the sense of, like some kind of dark way of, Halloween type way, but like, hey, God is really big, and He says it's all good, and He says it's beautiful, and to look at the ups and downs of life and agree with God, but like it does sort of force us to reckon with, hey, we're small, and we're just small creatures in this big world with a big God, and He's accomplishing all His good pleasure, and He's working in ways that are not as purposeful, as meaningful.
Well, and I like, there's a different translation that says, so that they will stand in awe of Him. So it's interesting, again, some translations say so that they will fear him. And even you took kind of a, more of a, it's not negative, but it's this, righteous fear of God. That there's this, wow, he's different. This is, and it's somewhat scary, me as a creature and him as a God. But when we look at the context of what Solomon's talking about here in Ecclesiastes, he takes an extremely positive route to that. And that's why I like that better, to where it says, so the verse says, and I know that everything that God makes or does endures forever. So it's this perspective that all this life stuff that Solomon has laid out, he's saying, wait a minute, God is participating in this, and he's working and doing, and it's not vain, it's not worthless, it's actually the opposite. It is of utmost value, and everything he makes and does, it all lasts forever. And he says, and he does this so that they will fear him, or I like it better where it says, so that they will stand in awe of him. Because it gives this different perspective to go, wait a minute, this stuff I thought was terrible, and that ultimately when I'm trying to get my own thing out of it, is just worthless, is vain. Or Solomon says it's just a shadow. Man's life is just a shadow. It's here and it's gone, so what's the point? But he's saying, wait a minute, God is saying that there is a point. And that everything that I'm experiencing here is actually part of his work, and he says it's beautiful, and it lasts forever? Wait a minute, there's a different perspective. And I'll get to what, again, we're going to barely get to it, as usual. It says in verse 15, that which is already has been, that which it is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. Really, it's almost like a Hebrew, almost like a poem there. That's really hard to understand right there. But it's another translation says, whatever happens or can happen has already happened before. And then another one says, God makes the same thing happen again and again. What does that thought give you in light of what we're talking about right here? So what is God doing? What is he making in the midst of this?
He continues to make beautiful things.
He continues to make beautiful things.
My translation says appropriate things in its time.
That makes me think of the first part of chapter 3 where it's talking about there's a season for everything, there's a time for everything, and then he gives all those everythings. But the main point is there is a purpose behind what God is doing in each one of your lives. And from God's perspective, it's beautiful. And guess what he keeps doing over and over again? Beautiful stuff. Yeah.
Just the word that keeps going to my mind is redemption. So just that he's redeeming those things that we see as broken or insufficient or tragic even, and the suffering, like all that ugly stuff that we're talking about, and just to see that God can redeem that and can make something good. And so I guess and then the whole thing, even like spiritually too, as I was thinking about that, what he makes lasts forever. So that work that he does in us lasts forever. Like that's, you know what I mean? That's right with his redemption.
Right.
It's full and final, and that's such comfort.
What's interesting, I'm not saying this is what you meant, but you said he can redeem. And I think from the point of Scripture is he is redeeming. Especially when you tie this together with what Jeff has been talking about in Ephesians. What does God, through Paul, lay out in the first two chapters? Especially the first two chapters of Ephesians? He's saying what he's already done.
And just that awesome heart that God has to do that. You know what I mean? Like not to leave us in that state of vanity and misery. And it's just...
I'm writing down God with us, Emmanuel. And so, what does Solomon say? So, in light of that, this brief perspective that we just got, in chapter 3, again, which we already talked about last week, but I wanted to concentrate on this one word that we'll have about 8 minutes to concentrate on. Is he says, so therefore, guess what? You guys remember what he says? He says something before do good. That's a hint. In the army, they go like this when they tell you the answer to the quiz question. You write it down real quick. It's in verse 12. Verse 12 says, I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful. I like the verb. Than to rejoice. So he says, everything that I perceive that vanity of vanities, what man labors and toils for, and what they're trying to get from it is just empty, valueless stuff. And I've perceived that God is working in the midst of that, and he's doing beautiful things. He's redeeming all of that, and he strives with man. Again, I'm putting this in my own words. He's God with us in the midst of life, and that's what he's doing. So then he says, so guess what? You can continue to work and rejoice. Be joyful. He says, be joyful and do good. So for me, especially with the way I've been experiencing myself, well, what's interesting too is if you kind of a summary of 16 through 22. I'll just read it. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness. And in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and every work. And I said in my heart, with regard to the children of man, that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. Okay, what does that bring to mind? This is what I talk about every time I'm talking about God, okay, you guys? God and man. What?
To be candid with you, you talked about the justice is even corrupt, right? I think about the greatest military in the world is our military, correct? Even we were capable of doing something like My Lai in Vietnam. That just goes to show you even maybe the closest thing we have to a perfect country is it's not fallible, right?
Okay, so Elliot's kind of going to the depravity of man and look at the bad stuff that we can do, which is exactly true. I think this is really simplistic in the sense that he's just saying, hey guys, Solomon's going, I perceive that we're creatures just like animals. Listen to what he says next. He says he's talking about God's involvement. And you can take that as negative, but I think it shows you this perspective. That God, he says, God is allowing the children of man to, the word is tested. He tests them that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. He says, for what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity. Now, this is interesting, because if I were to talk to Solomon, I would have said, hey, you just contradicted yourself, Solomon. And again, I can say this with freedom. I don't think this is like a contradiction of Scripture. I think this is showing the struggle of the heart of man and how you're seeing Solomon, and he's talking out loud. Well, he just said God placed eternity in man's heart, which you could say is different from normal beasts. But it's just interesting. What I see is Solomon kind of pinging back and forth, kind of wrestling with himself, wrestling with what he sees regarding the children of man, but then he's going back to God's part in it. So he says they all have the same breath. Man has no advantage over the beast, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and to dust they all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? So this is, again, the pinging back and forth. You think, well, that's negative. Solomon's a Debbie Downer. But again, to me, it's the struggle. It's this conflict in his heart. But then he goes right back to pointing to God in the last verse. He says, so I saw that there's nothing better than that man should, and he says it again, rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? That's a reference to what he said in chapter 2, where he was working, he was striving, he was richer than rich. Remember what he said about, he kind of had this epiphany about, well, wait a minute. I can't guarantee that the guy who gets my stuff after I die is going to be smart with the stuff that he got from me. He didn't have to work for it. I worked for it. He didn't have to work for it, and he may squander it. And that was part of Solomon going, what in the world? From a human perspective, from a toddler perspective, the human answer is, that's no fair. If Paul gets my stuff after I die, he should have to work for it. It's no fair. But then he says, so what do you do with that? What do you do with this? What do you do with this reality? And what's the verb that we see him use twice in chapter 3? He says, rejoice. Now, obviously, he's not saying rejoice over this, right? But as he's showing us this, it is the platform with which we dive into the reality of what God does or makes. Guess what he's in the business of doing? For eternity, over and over and over again. He's doing beautiful stuff in your life, even or especially when you think it is uglier than heck. Even when you think it's evil, which is interesting too, tying back to what Solomon said there in chapter 1, where he says, I'm looking at this evil stuff God told the children of man to do, trying to figure out what's useful about it, what's good about it. Now he's saying, holy cow, wait a minute. Everything God does is beautiful. So instead of wallowing in my depression and anxiety now, he says, hey, you know what? And to me, this is where it's tied to resting. He's saying, take a deep breath and rejoice. Work and rejoice with this perspective. That everything I'm going through is beautiful in God's eyes, or in His intent. And what I did is I was going to read all these verses. I'll just read a couple. They're all Psalms. Pass that out. I don't have enough for every individual, so if there's couples, just share. So it's the same word or verb to rejoice. Okay, and this is just a whole list of verses in Psalms. I'll just read the first couple and then we'll pray to end this. And again, think about that the psalmist is coming at it from the same perspective. It's a big context where life has happened, and yet he's looking to God and realizing, wow, what's the bigger perspective of God my Father? And he says this, Psalm 5, verse 11, but let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them ever shout for joy. May you shelter them, that those who love your name may rejoice in you, that all who love your name may be filled with joy. Psalm 9, verses 1 through 2, for the choir master, this is interesting, to the tune of the death of the Son, a psalm of David. I will give thanks to the Lord with all my heart. I will recount all your wonders. I will be glad and rejoice in you. I will sing praise to your name, O Most High. I encourage you to read the rest of these, because when you start to hear those words like wonders or work or toil, again, think of the contrast between the toiling of man and the labor of man that Solomon's talking about in Ecclesiastes, and then to where he's pointing to the toil and the labor and the work of God. The psalmist points to the same thing over and over again, and he's saying, look at the toil, look at the work that God is doing, and rejoice. Psalm 16, I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad, and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also will rest in hope. For you will not abandon my heart to Sheol. Think about this in light of what Solomon said about setting eternity in man's heart. So the psalmist says right here, my flesh will also rest in hope, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol. or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life, and in your presence there is fullness of joy, and at your right hand are pleasures evermore, forevermore. So read the rest of those verses. I wanted to talk about the practical aspect of how do you rejoice? And is this kind of that, is this encouraging us to do what we normally have done in church land and encourage people who are not, I'm going to make up a word, who are not rejoiceful, who are not full of joy, who are struggling with worry, anger, anxiety, all the fruits of a frustrated sovereign. So how do you then rejoice in the midst of that? You just gut it out, grit your teeth, put in a mouthpiece, bite down real hard and go, okay, I'm going to try to rejoice here. So how does that happen? So hopefully next week we can kind of talk about the practical aspect of, yeah, how does that happen? How do you rejoice? How does that happen in one's life? I mean, Solomon is pointing at the reality of life, which includes the reality of God. And he's saying, hey, you know what? Go to work now and be filled with joy. So I hope that we can talk about that next week. Let me pray. Dear Lord God, I thank you for, again, the words that you've left us in Scripture, Lord. I thank you for Solomon. I thank you for what you, for how you were Emmanuel to him. That you strove with him in the midst of his humanness, his creatureness, in the midst of his sinfulness, and you redeemed him. And you showed him that your intent for him and for us is only meant to be beautiful. And that your work of redemption and grace is something that when you miraculously show each of us that, it gives immense hope. And it can give joy. And I pray, God, that you would help each of us to remember what we talked about this morning as different things happen to us this week. And that the moments that we experience dissatisfaction or frustration or fear or any of those fruits of a frustrated sovereign, God, that when we experience those things, the Lord, it thrusts us to you, and that you help us get this perspective that you are intending good for us, and that we can rejoice in that, and that in that moment we can experience freedom and joy and peace. We thank you for your love in Jesus' name.